What is Phasmophobia? Phasmophobia is a 1 to 4 player cooperative psychological horror experience where the players are tasked with one job: collecting evidence to find out what ghost type is haunting that location. However, the game seems to lack support for one group of players: the newer players. I reached out to some other people for help compiling this video, and the results varied.
Lady, black developers just had a few scantily clad women around the levels, perhaps a flamingo lady. Why not make the revenant just a little more cheeked up when these you know?
Why the deogen so dummy thick?
But with different perspectives, it was a bit easier to compile the thoughts for this video. However, before the video starts, I would like to mention that most of, if not all, the points brought up in this video are not that of my own, and the only sources I have are the game's journals, the wiki pages for Phasmophobia. So there might be a relatively good chance that I miss important info. This is also my first attempt at this sort of a video, so maybe go a little light on me. With that all out of the way, let's start with the positive. Phasmophobia, at the time of this being uploaded, has 24 ghost types. As you can imagine, it'd be hard to tell them apart when first taking a look at them. However, as you play the game more, you begin to see that each ghost type has something unique about them. Each ghost type in the game has a unique way of acting under different circumstances. Some of the ghost types show these behaviors when not attacking the player, and some of these behaviors are only shown when the ghost is attacking the player. Regardless, these different behaviors are unique enough that experienced players are capable of identifying the ghost without even getting any of the necessary evidence to prove it. There's even a difficulty with this premise in mind: nightmare difficulty. In this difficulty, the ghost will purposely avoid giving the player one of their pieces of evidence, requiring that the player understand how each ghost acts in order to identify them without being able to prove it. The game keeps itself spiced up by randomizing every game, from the location of where the ghost is, to what type it is, to what it decides to do, the optional objectives, the name, and even how many people the ghost will respond to. The game is heavily randomized and makes every contract a different experience. And if it's played on the same map over and over and over again, even if the difficulty is the same, it can add randomness to your contract, be it on Professional as to when the ghost decides to roam to, or on Nightmare, where the ghost chooses one of its pieces of evidence to purposefully obscure. The Kinetic Games team works really hard to constantly push out updates for the game. These updates usually consist of things you'd expect, like bug fixes or minor changes, but they also usually push out updates that balance the game or make it more difficult. The game, on average, seems to receive at least one update every other week or so, small or not. Now that the positives are out of the way, it's time to shift gears towards the main point of this video: the parts of this game and its updates that, while benefiting the veterans of the game, hurt the casual players and the newer players. The tutorial is usually one of the first areas of a game that the developer wants a newer player to go to. Usually, a tutorial has a rather basic level of information on the game itself, usually just a basic grasp of how to play, or in some cases how to survive. Phasmophobia's tutorial hasn't been majorly changed since the game's early access launch. The tutorial tells the player exactly where the ghost is located, and the player is tasked with grabbing its 3 pieces of evidence before it leaves. However, the game neglects to actively show each piece of evidence in action, leaving the player up to interpretation with the images shown of each potential piece of evidence they didn't get. This means that if the player wants to see each piece of evidence in action, they would need to keep reloading the tutorial until they got a ghost that has it. The game also writes out these pieces of evidence as if they are consistent, which some of them aren't, which could lead to a potential misunderstanding. The tutorial also neglects to mention hunting. With hunts being a staple part of a mission that's gone on for a little too long, it's very likely the newer player playing on amateur to take a while to find the ghost or its type, which could result in a hunt. And if the player doesn't know how to handle hunts, it could result in an unfair death. On the topic of taking a while, arguably one of the most important things for a newer player to do is to figure out the ghost type to complete their contract. With there being 7 different types of evidence, there are plenty of different possible combinations for each ghost type. While each ghost has a consistent set of evidence, how likely you are to get this evidence can vary heavily. Certain pieces of evidence are rather consistent, such as a ghost orb almost always being visible on night vision camera, or all but one of the ghosts with fingerprints have a 100% chance to leave them on any door, light switch, window, or keyboard they interact with. However, others can be purely up to chance, the biggest offenders being writing in EMF 5. Whilst EMF 5 isn't terrible, it's only a 25% chance to get per every interaction. Meanwhile, ghostwriting is one I'm not even sure of. I've had games where the ghostwriting book got filled immediately, and some of the games where the ghost took well over 10 minutes to write in a book, leading me to believe it was a different type. With how long you possibly be in the house for, you could be in the danger of the ghost hunting. And this next part is all but another issue for newer players. One of the best ways to know how safe you are staying in a location is the team's average sanity. The truck provides a meter for every player, and figuring out what the average sanity is at isn't an issue. However, figuring out what decreases sanity is an issue. The journal provided to the player has a description as to what might be the cause, that being standing in dark areas or witnessing paranormal entities. However, the description only scratches the surface. The excuse can be made that the ghost types that affect the player's sanity aren't an issue, to which I don't really have a valid argument. However, certain ghost events and other aspects are harder to forgive, primarily the ghost events where no sanity is drained, and the unmentioned detail that the death of a teammate takes 15% sanity from everyone who's still alive. This is a minor gripe, but with certain events not removing sanity and certain gameplay aspects to actively taking sanity, you may be exposed to unexpected hunts. And speaking of hunts, hunts are where the players can get punished. If your sanity dips too low, the ghost has a chance to hunt. This, of course, can be prevented maximum of 2 times with the crucifix or delayed by a certain amount of time using smudge sticks. However, after this point, it's up to you to survive, which is easy. Granted, you've read the wiki or watched a YouTube video on how to survive. If your goal is to play this game without spoiling yourself on anything about it, you're pretty screwed, as there is no mention of a ghost hunt outside the objectives, or maybe very loosely on some ghost info pages. The potential idea that player might have on how to survive hunts are placed in loading screen tips, and one of the optional objectives of that one being repel the ghost with a smudge stick while it's chasing someone. To most, it may be intuitive to hide. However, that brings up the issues of electronics. It seems about right that when trying to hide your presence, you'd want to be quiet, and the electronic devices that are visible, like flashlights, or make noise, like the EMF reader and spirit box, need to be turned off. But other objects offset this so much, such as a digital photo camera somehow luring a ghost to your location. Doesn't emit any light unless you take a photo, and the same goes for its sound, but the ghost is still lured by it? What about glow sticks and candles? Those both emit light, yet no ghost is interested in them at all. So finding the fine line on your own is way too rough. And hunts only become harder when you include... As I mentioned earlier, the ghosts in the game have unique abilities, be it ones that only show up when the ghost isn't hunting, and others that only show up when the ghost is hunting. Some of which, as you could probably guess at this point, aren't very fair for a new player while they're still learning. Some of which are ghosts that hunt at higher sanity levels than others, like the Onryo, or Demon. Others offset the normal gameplay, such as a Deogen, or Mimic. And the rest exist for seemingly no reason other than to catch you off guard, like the Revenant, or Raiju. These ghost types are able to completely throw off a game where a player might finally be beginning to understand the game's concepts, by throwing them a random curveball that sometimes even the game fails to mention. The Deogen fails to explain how swiftly it moves when approaching a player. The Demon fails to mention that it can either hunt at any sanity level, or at 70% as opposed to 50%, whichever you interpret to be worse. And the Wraith completely fails to mention its random chance to teleport, passing it off instead as is capable of flying, when it still makes footstep sounds. Or the Moroi, where it's not at all mentioned that the curse is inflicted using a spirit box or parabolic microphone, meaning that the game punishes you for playing it. The info, unfortunately, is mostly hidden in the patch notes. Not entirely the worst place to put all the information about game changes, but when it's the only place these details are mentioned, you begin to run into an issue. For one, anyone who didn't own this game before that patch was released will not be able to read these notes unless they dig through their news section. This means that some ideas the players might try, for example, hiding behind doors, would get them killed, with no way to understand why other than to look up an outside source or an old patch note list on the mail. They wouldn't know what happened. And another example to this would be some of the Ghost's secondary abilities, namely those of the newer ghost types like the Thay, Deogen, and Moroi, would be completely unknown to those who picked up a copy unless they could view the patch notes. There may be a way I'm unaware of to view the patch notes other than the news from before you played, but that still requires way more digging than is necessary, though maybe for some of the upcoming changes it could be better for newer players. Now, what I mean by this is only changing an aspect of the game that a newer player would use, and leaving the ones that the veteran players use alone. What I mean by this is modifying the amateur and maybe intermediate difficulty. But if the devs somehow see this, then it's really up to them as to whether or not they want to implement these changes into intermediate or even amateur. Or maybe they could just even make a difficulty lower than amateur, something called practice. But here are just some ideas that I would like to pitch to them to make the game more friendly to newer players. A lot of information the game is withholding could be more useful to the player. The journal could stand to be way less vague about ghost abilities such as the Wraith's teleport, or the Deogen's extremely fast locating speed. On top of this, adding information about hunts and what to do during them could be very useful, as well as informing a player on each ghost's page about its average hunting sanity threshold, or about what sanity level the ghost can hunt at. Mimic, of course, would just still be left as vague, as the ghost is supposed to be unpredictable. As far as I'm aware, the tutorial for Phasmophobia has been the same since its early access Steam launch back in September of 2020, and so much of the game has changed. They could maybe have a ghost type exclusive to the tutorial that has all 7 pieces of evidence, so that the player could see what each piece looks like in action. They also added the tarot card, the High Priestess, which, if no one is dead, revives the next player to die. Perhaps they could implement this into the tutorial for hunts that would allow the player to experiment and try out to find different ways to survive during a hunt. Then, allow the player a determined way to end the tutorial, like successfully surviving 3 hunts, all of which last different times, like amateur time, intermediate time, and professional nightmare time. It seems like a stretch by far when you hear this idea simplified down to this. However, the overall idea would be to only implement one of the listed ideas just to decrease the chance of a newer player getting caught off guard. Option 1. Decrease the chance of receiving lethal ghost types. By far the biggest stretch I would think, but still not a terrible idea. Allowing the player the same gameplay as other difficulties, but reducing the chances of receiving either early hunters or high-speed chasers. Of course, if they were to go with this choice, they'd only need to remove 1, else it feels like the game's being a bit too easy. But some of these ghost types can be brutal, especially just like the demon, or mimic. Option 2. Disable secondary evidence on the lower difficulties. Sure, every ghost type would just become bland at that point, being the same type of ghost, and really not having any sort of characteristics to them. It'd be worthless trying to analyze any of the different types of abilities that are listed in the journal, but it'd be worth it just to give the player a learning chance at figuring out how to get the evidence, or how to survive during a hunt. And the last possible idea I could come up with is to make a distinguish between a ghost event and a ghost hunt. I recently asked one of my buddies what he thought killed players most in the older builds, which boiled down to mostly simple player mistakes on their own part. But when asked about when people tend to die most during hunts in the current builds, it's usually at the start, because players tend to fail to distinguish if it's a hunt or if it's just an event. With that out of the way though, I think it's time to move on to the final part. I know that this video most likely looks and sounds like an absolute mess, but I'd like to thank you for sticking around to stay to the end. Like I said, Phasmophobia is by no means a bad game. It does a great job catering to its dedicated players. I just wish it would do a little more to encourage new players to start playing, and for casual players to keep playing. And with the custom difficulty update right around the corner, maybe it might solve some of these problems. I'd also like to state that none of my changes need to be implemented exactly the way I word them, but it would still be nice to see some of them in the game in some way, shape, or form. I'd also like to say I did not make this video completely on my own. I had a lot of help doing this, so I'd like to shout out Ecto and Tropic, Lazy Liable, and Bonbon for their contributions to the script and the organizing of it, as well as those same three, Electrum55, and GG Dom for the gameplay. If you enjoyed this or hated it, leave a rating, share it with others who might also like it or hate it, and leave a comment on any point you agree with or some constructive criticism on some points that I may have missed info on, or overall might be just wrong on. And with that, I'll leave you to some bonus clips I got while recording gameplay for this video. And I'm definitely not just mad that my name is not a possible ghost name. So, you just... That checks out, right? Yeah, checks out.
Constitution says you do. So do I. I believe that until proven guilty, every man, woman, and child in this country is innocent.
Hello everybody, my name is Markiplier and welcome back to Five Nights at Freddy's. But now, okay. Well,
Oh no, there's a woman coming to kill me! Guys, I think this place is...
It's not an event.
I think this place is haunted! Guys, I think this place is haunted!
How are you alive?
Guys, I think this place is haunted! I think
No
this...
fucking
I
shit.
think this place is haunted! Guys, I
Wait,
think...
guys, I got some.
I think this place is
I got some
haunted!
music to help.
Guys,
Oh god,
I
it's
think...
chasing
I think this place is haunted!